Mr. Annan, Alec Russell from the Financial Times. You probably fear I'll never stop asking you questions, but just one more.
Good to see you, Alec.
Very nice to see you. If we can return to the continent of your birth.
Yes.
At the moment, there is understandably an extraordinary excitement about sub-Saharan Africa, and some of that has been reflected in this brilliant session in the last couple of days. And this is both investors who are suddenly seeing huge opportunities there, but it's also not just Western investors. As we know, China is showing a lot of interest. And yet, you yourself, over your long career, have seen hopes rise and fall about Africa. You came of age in Ghana at a hugely exciting time and then saw some of those hopes dashed. You worked in Ethiopia when Haile Selassie was in power and the OAU was getting going, and again that was dashed. For these dreams of Africa finally achieving its potential and standing proud on the world stage and being an investment haven to be realized, what more needs to be done in Africa itself?
There are a couple of things Africa needs to do. The first is that we need to continue to improve governance, which includes coming up with the right regulatory environment that will attract investors. And when I say investors, I'm not looking at only external investors, because governments sometimes tend to forget that their local entrepreneurs need the same conditions as the foreign investors need to be able to invest, to release that energy. They need to understand that the conditions under which they are investing will be retained for the 5-10 years or so for them to get their investments back. They need to understand that the government will not change the rules on them. They need to understand in those situations that the government is a competitor, to not change the rules to its own advantage. They also have to work in preparing the workforce. And here, I think we can do a much better job than we are doing so far. I would like to see more vocational training, where people are given skills and come out of school ready to work or start their own business. We created the impression that everybody has to go to university. And we have all these university graduates coming up. And we saw this phenomenon in North Africa with no jobs, frustrated, educated youth. And so that is an area we also need to look at very critically. The other point I would want to stress is that apart from good governance and respect for rule of law and human rights, we need to open up to younger people, younger generation. We need to push generational change. There are some bright young people coming up who have had experience in Europe and America who are beginning to go back, that we should attract to go back. The reverse brain drain made a great difference to India, countries like Mexico and Chile, and I hope the same thing will happen in Africa. And in fact, some of the younger ones who have had good education and good training cannot even begin to think or do some of the things the old-time leaders are doing. And what also encourages me is the rapid development of civil society. There's robust civil society developing in Africa, and they are going to keep the politicians on their toes. I mean, I had the privilege of doing some work in Kenya after the crisis and worked with the government and civil society and people to push changes. I couldn't have done that work without civil society. Women's organizations, church leaders, youth movements, and I met with them, and they are making a difference, and I'm beginning to see this in other parts of Africa, and we should support and promote that development.
Michael Ignatieff from Canada, you served a particular institution with extraordinary distinction, and I'm just wondering what you think, Mr. Secretary General, the UN needs to do, the specific tasks that it needs to do to reinforce its legitimacy and effectiveness in the years ahead.
I think that links up with the issue Jeremy raised about the divisions within the... I think we need to define an agenda that really rallies and brings everybody around. We keep saying we are in a global village, or we are all in the same boat. But there are different types of boats. Let's say we are all in a cruiser, and some have fantastic suites on top and some are in the hold. But if there's a problem with the boat, we are all at risk. The one in the most expensive suite and the one in the hold somewhere. So we need to get people to accept that we have to work together and that a threat to one is a threat to all, and come up with an agenda that will avoid the type of divisions Jeremy was talking about. Secondly, I think the organization will need to go through serious reform, particularly the Security Council, because lots of governments feel that the power base of the UN is too narrowly defined, and that the 5 countries with veto powers have too much influence. So whatever proposal you put forward is seen in terms of power, who gains and who loses. And it distorts the real debate that if we can reform the council and bring around the table some of the other powerful countries from regions, I mean, it is indefensible that today India is not a member of the council. Japan, the second largest contributor, is not there. Africa, a continent of 53 nations, doesn't have a single permanent. Latin America doesn't have it. So the idea was to bridge these holes and create additional permanencies, not necessarily with veto, without veto. Some say, why don't you take away the veto? You can't. The 5 permanent members have to agree, and I don't see them agreeing to that. You know, I often say that there are 2 things in the world which are extremely difficult to take away: subsidies, when you give it, and privileges. But we hear a lot about subsidies because there's often the privilege who's talking about subsidies to the other. But those 2 are extremely difficult to take away. But we need to find a way of reforming the council. And in fact, if we reform the council, not only will the UN become more democratic and representative, it will gain in greater legitimacy. And not only that, I think it will foster cooperation. Given what is happening in the world and the shift taking place to Asia and some of the emerging countries, if we are going to have a cooperative world, we need to share power. And so those with the privilege today will have to sit and think very seriously, how much power are they going to give to the new arrivals to make their participation meaningful? Then we will get real cooperation. Otherwise, down the line, we are going to get destructive competition. And some may even ignore decisions taken by the council. So I would hope one would go, but it does take time. I recall when I started pushing for reform of the UN, within 6 weeks, somebody managed to get a piece into the New York Times complaining that I had not reformed the UN in 6 weeks flat. And it was the day I was having one of our monthly lunches with the Security Council. I don't know if Jeremy was there, but if I tell the story, he may remember. In any case, I started my remarks to the Council by apologizing for my failure to reform the UN in 6 weeks flat. Sergei Lavrov, who is now the Russian foreign minister and was then the Russian ambassador in the room, and the only communist in the room, quoted God. He said, Mr. Secretary General, what are you complaining about? You've had more time than God had to create the world. So I responded by saying, Mr. Ambassador, you are right. But God had a unique advantage. He worked alone.